Seon was a man whose name made even the boldest traders lower their eyes. He built his fortune through trade, salt, gold, livestock, and controlled every major deal in the region. Wherever his name was spoken, it carried weight, fear, and silence. People didn't greet him with warmth, they greeted him with caution. He was tall, sharp-eyed, and never wasted words. His expression rarely changed, and when it did, it only showed anger or pride. The village believed Seon was blessed by the spirits of wealth, but no one dared question how he earned his power. They only knew he had it, and that was enough. Behind the doors of his stone-built house, Seon was a different kind of ruler. There, no traders watched, no neighbors listened, and there, he ruled not with coins, but with fists. His wife, Imela, knew this side of him better than anyone. She lived in constant fear, her voice soft, her movements careful, her eyes often downcast. Seon didn't see her as a partner. He saw her as a possession, like his land and his gold. When he spoke to her, it was with commands, not care. And if she displeased him, she felt it, not in words, but in bruises hidden beneath heavy robes. To the outside world, Seon was a man of status. Inside his home, he was a storm that never passed. And still, no one asked questions. No one dared, because Seon was not just powerful, he was untouchable. Imela moved through the village like a shadow in the sun, soft, slow, and careful. She was Seon's wife, known for her quiet smile and kind eyes. Her belly had begun to show. The villagers whispered that the child might be the son Seon always wanted. But behind her grace, behind her gentle voice, there was pain too heavy for words. She walked with measured steps, not just because of the weight of pregnancy, but because of the bruises beneath her robe, dark, hidden, and aching. Even in the heat of the dry season, she wore long, layered clothing. The cloth hid more than her skin. It hid the truth. Every morning, Imela woke before the sun and prepared Seon's food. She folded his robes just the way he liked. She served him before eating herself. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice was barely louder than a whisper. Her life revolved around his moods, his demands, his anger. One wrong word, one forgotten task, and the silence of their home would shatter under the sound of his rage. But the next day, she'd still rise, still cook, still cover the bruises. It was a cycle no one spoke about, because everyone already knew. The other women in the village saw her. They noticed the limp in her walk, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands shook when she handed over coins at the market. But they said nothing. They only offered half-hearted smiles and pitiful glances. Deep down, some of them understood too well. Some had husbands like Seon. Others feared becoming like Imela. And in Kurotu, people had learned to mind their own business. "It's not our house," they would say. "It's a family matter." These words weren't just spoken. They were believed. The silence wasn't just fear. It was tradition. Even the elders, the ones who claimed wisdom, turned their faces away. Seon was powerful after all. What could they say to a man who controlled the village's gold and trade? Who could stand up to a man whose money fed their children? So they let Imela suffer in silence, just like many women before her. In Kurotu, a man's home was his kingdom, and what he did inside it was not for others to question. But Imela had no power, no voice, only the small, quiet hope that the life inside her would be different. She would sometimes rest her hands on her belly when no one was watching and whisper small dreams about freedom, about peace, about a child who would never know the sound of fear. But even those dreams were brief, because when Seon's voice echoed through the walls, calling her name, she had to move, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much she wished she didn't have to. She lived in the space between hope and fear, day after day, with no one to speak for her and nowhere to run. Seon's mind was chained to one idea: legacy. Everything he had built, his wealth, his land, his name, meant nothing if he had no son to carry it forward. To him, a daughter would be a disgrace, a soft ending to his hard-earned power. Every time he looked at Imela's growing belly, he didn't see a child. He saw a throne, waiting to be filled, and only a male could sit on it. He believed that a man's strength should live on through his bloodline, and the thought of that legacy being broken sent waves of rage through him. In the quiet hours, when the house grew still and the winds outside faded, Seon's thoughts darkened. He stared at Imela when she slept. Eyes narrowed, heart full of doubt. What if the child was a girl? What if the universe dared to mock him? The whispers in his mind became louder with each passing day. He watched how Imela walked, how she ate, how her stomach moved, as if those things would reveal the baby's gender. He began snapping more often, over cold food, over silence, over nothing at all. His voice turned into thunder, and his hands followed quickly behind. He started muttering about blood and names and sons. At first, Imela tried to stay calm. She smiled gently, hoping to ease him. But Seon didn't want calm. He wanted control. And when calm didn't give him answers, his fear turned into fury. He accused her of carrying weakness, of poisoning his future with her softness. He called her womb a gamble he didn't trust. And Imela, though afraid, knew there was no winning. Her words would only feed his fire, and silence wasn't safe either. He began speaking of purity, of how strong men needed to pass their strength to sons, not daughters. He said women were only vessels, and some vessels were too weak to carry greatness. He started talking like a man whose soul was rotting, blaming Imela for things not yet known, punishing her for things she couldn't control. He said he could feel that the child inside her would be a failure, that the stars were turning against him, and he convinced himself that Imela was part of that betrayal. His threats grew darker. He would stand close to her, breathing heavily, his fists clenched, saying things like, "If you curse me with a girl, I'll take it out on both of you." Imela didn't know if he meant it, but she believed him, because Seon was no longer just cruel. He was unraveling. He stopped touching her gently, stopped speaking like a husband. Everything became about control, about the bloodline, about his right to shape the future. And every day, Imela lived under the weight of that pressure, praying the child inside her wouldn't become the reason for their destruction. The fear inside the house became thicker than the air outside. Seon's obsession grew into madness. He couldn't focus on trade. He barely slept. He searched the skies for signs, shouted at the wind, and began accusing Imela of hiding the truth, as if she somehow already knew what the child would be and was keeping it from him. There was no space for love, no space for joy, only power, fear, and the growing shadow of what was to come. The night air was thick and restless when Seon came stumbling home. His robe was half open, the smell of palm wine clinging to him like sweat. His face was twisted with fury. A major trade deal had fallen apart. Gold promised had vanished, and merchants had walked away. He felt humiliated, and humiliation always needed a target. As he pushed through the door, his eyes searched for blame, and they landed on Imela. She stood quietly, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She had been preparing a warm meal, hopeful that feeding him might soften his mood. But Seon didn't want food, he wanted blood. He threw the bowl to the ground, its contents splashing across the floor. He began shouting that she was cursed, that since she'd become pregnant, everything had gone wrong. He screamed that she was the reason his fortune was fading, that she was bad luck wrapped in silence. Imela tried to calm him, her voice gentle, her body still. She whispered that it wasn't her fault, that the deal could still be fixed. But Seon wasn't listening. His hands balled into fists, and then the storm began. The first strike landed hard across her face, knocking her to the ground. She covered her belly, instinctively shielding the life inside her. She begged him, "Please, not the baby." But the more she begged, the angrier he became. Every plea sounded to him like weakness, every tear like guilt. He kicked, hit, and shouted. His rage echoed off the stone walls, drowning out her cries. She tried to crawl, but her body couldn't keep up. The baby inside her twisted, still alive, still hoping. Then came the final blow, a strike so hard it silenced everything. Imela collapsed, her head hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her eyes opened for a moment, empty, wide, and then slowly shut. The house grew quiet, so quiet it felt like time itself had stopped breathing. Seon stood over her, panting, his chest rising and falling like a beast who had just killed without thinking. Reality crept in slowly, and for the first time, he panicked. He dropped to his knees, shook her, called her name, but she didn't move. He touched her wrist, no pulse. Touched her cheek, cold. But even in panic, Seon stayed calculated. There could be no scandal, No questions, no whispers. If the village knew, his reputation would shatter. Without a word, he lifted her lifeless body, carefully, as if not to leave a trace. He wrapped her in cloth and carried her through the back of the house. The moon was high, watching silently. Behind his storehouse, where no one went at night, he began to dig. His hands worked fast, his breath shallow. When the hole was deep enough, he placed her in, covering her slowly with earth. No prayer, no final words, just dirt and silence and fear. As he wiped his hands and looked at the grave, there was no sorrow on his face, only a cold, empty glare. To the world, nothing had changed. The merchant's house stood tall, but beneath the soil behind it, something sacred had been broken, and something else, something powerful and unknown, had just begun. The next morning, the village of Kurotu woke as it always did. The sun climbed quietly into the sky and the people began their work. But something unusual stirred near Seon's storehouse. Omer, the old man who spent his days digging water trenches, walked by with his shovel resting on his shoulder. His knees ached and his hands were stiff, but his ears were sharp. As he passed the edge of the storehouse, he stopped. He thought he heard something, soft, like a whimper, like a cry swallowed by the earth. He paused, listened again, and there it was, faint but real, a sound no one would expect to come from a grave. Omer stepped closer, his heart quickening. The sound came from the ground itself, from a patch of disturbed soil that didn't quite match the rest. He dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the dirt. There it was again, a baby's cry, fragile and tired, but alive. Without thinking, Omer began to dig, not with his shovel, but with his hands. He clawed at the earth, fingers tearing through dry soil, heart pounding with something between fear and hope. He dug until his hands bled, until sweat poured down his face. Then at last, he saw cloth, a bundle, wrapped tightly. He pulled it up, heart trembling, and slowly peeled it open. Inside was a newborn baby, eyes wide open, chest rising and falling. The child did not cry now. He only looked at Omer, calm and alert, as if he had been waiting. Omer's mouth fell open. This child, born in the belly of the earth, buried beneath silence and death, was alive. There was no mother in sight, no warmth, no air, and yet here he was, breathing like the world owed him more time. Omer sat back, holding the baby to his chest. The grave had not swallowed this one. The earth had carried him instead. The old man stood slowly, still holding the child, and looked up at the sky. Something greater was at work. This was not a normal birth. This was not a normal child. He felt it in the way the baby stared back at him. Not afraid, not confused, just aware, strong, present. Omer whispered a name, as if it had been placed in his mouth by something unseen. Zui, he said softly, the one who lives when none should. He carried Zui away from that cursed ground, away from the house where silence had hidden screams. As he walked, the village women saw him and gasped. A baby. From where? How? But Omer said nothing yet. He only walked, the child in his arms, his eyes full of tears he hadn't expected. The boy had survived what no child should. Born beneath the earth, yet untouched by death. Buried by hate, yet risen by something divine. Something had been set in motion. And Kurotu, though it didn't know it yet, would never be the same again. Zui grew up in the care of Omer, the old trench digger whose hands had pulled him from death's doorway. Their home was small and quiet, tucked on the edge of Kurotu, where the dust swirled soft and the air stayed still. Omer didn't speak much, and Zui didn't ask questions. From the moment he could walk, Zui moved like someone listening to a rhythm no one else could hear. He never cried loudly, never reached for toys. He would sit for hours, tracing lines in the dirt, staring at shapes, tapping his fingers against each other in strange patterns. While the other village children ran barefoot, laughing and chasing goats, Zui sat alone near the water trench, drawing circles, dots, and straight lines in the sand. Omer watched, unsure if it was play or something more. By the age of 4, Zui was using pebbles to count sacks of grain at the market before the sellers even finished loading them. He could tell how much water would fill a pot by looking at the shadow it cast. Omer asked him once how he knew. Zui only shrugged and said, "It fits in my head." At 6, he began noticing things no child should. He would look at the night sky and tell Omer when the stars would shift, and when the traders would come. He once predicted a heavy storm 3 days before the clouds even darkened. He said the numbers told him. He didn't laugh when other children did. He didn't join their games or sing during harvest dances. Instead, he mumbled to himself, numbers, sequences, rhythms. Sometimes he'd walk around the village, dragging his finger across walls and stones, leaving strange markings no one could understand. The elders began to whisper, "That's not a normal boy," they said. "He's marked." Some said it with fear, others with awe, but no one could deny he was different. Zooey would sit by the fire and suddenly murmur numbers. Moments later, a woman would go into labor, or a trader's bag would tear, spilling gold coins. Once, he stood in the market and whispered, 3, 5, 5. And that afternoon, 3 goats died, 5 baskets fell, and 5 strangers passed through the village gate. People started watching him from a distance. Children were told not to touch him. Mothers pulled their daughters closer when he walked by. Some believed he carried a gift. Others believed it was a curse. But Zooey didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He was always listening, always counting. The world to him wasn't made of stories or colors. It was made of numbers. Quiet, invisible, and endless. Omer, though puzzled, never stopped protecting him. He built Zooey a small space near the trench, where he could draw in peace. He brought him pieces of charcoal and smoothed out stones to write on. And every night, before sleep, he'd look at the boy and wonder what the gods had placed in his mind. Because whatever it wasn't meant for a quiet life. And deep down, Omer knew this child wasn't saved by accident. Seyon had risen higher than most men in Kurotu ever dreamed. After years of ruthless trade and silent threats, he became advisor to a regional chief, an honor given only to those seen as wise and strong. He married again, a young woman named Abeni, quiet like the first and just as obedient. He built a new home of stone, larger than any house in the village, with carved pillars and iron-bound doors. He walked through the village like a king, his voice loud, his robes rich, his eyes cold. People bowed as he passed, even though most feared, not respected him. Years passed, and no one spoke of Imela. It was as if she had vanished from memory. Seyon himself never mentioned her, but the ground does not forget, and neither does destiny. One morning, as the sun stretched across his new home, Seyon stepped outside and froze. In the sand just beyond his door was the number 10, neatly drawn with a finger. He looked around, but the street was empty. He wiped it away with his foot and muttered about pranksters. But the next morning, the number 9 was there. This time, it was carved into the wood of his gate. He called his guards, demanding answers. No one had seen anything. The third day, 8 appeared in black charcoal on his bedroom wall. It continued. Each day, a new number. 7 appeared burnt into the ground beside his prayer mat. 6 was made of salt and scattered across his breakfast tray. Seyon began to sweat in his sleep, waking with shouts and curses. He searched every corner of his home, pulled his servants aside, accused his new wife of sorcery. She cried and pleaded, but the numbers did not stop. 5 was carved into the mirror he used to trim his beard. 4 was scrawled onto his ledger, bleeding through every page. He burned the book, but the number reappeared the next morning, on the wall above his bed. No one could explain it. The village whispered that Seyon had gone mad, that spirits were visiting him. Some said a curse had been placed on his house. Others remembered Imela and lowered their voices. Seyon became restless. He paced at night. He slept with a knife. He ordered his wife not to speak unless spoken to. He shouted at shadows, broke things that creaked, avoided his own reflection. 3 appeared on his wine jar. 2 was carved onto the skin of a fish he hadn't touched yet. His hands began to shake. His once proud voice trembled in meetings. His arrogance cracked, replaced by something darker, pure fear. On the 9th day, he didn't sleep. He stood by the door with a torch, waiting. When the number 1 appeared, etched into the stone outside his gate in fresh blood, he screamed, but no one came. The village had grown tired of his madness, or perhaps they too were afraid. By then, Seyon knew. This wasn't the work of any man. The numbers weren't warnings. They were a countdown, and something was coming when it reached 0, something he could not buy, threaten, or bury. Kurotu had changed. The old ways were still there. Silent women, hard men, but whispers of change floated through the dusty air. A group of elders and merchants had decided it was time to educate the next generation. A school was built near the edge of the village, small but clean, its roof thatched and its walls lined with smooth clay. They put out word for a teacher, hoping someone from a nearby town might come. But the one who arrived came from no direction anyone recognized. He called himself Zui. He was tall, quiet, and moved with a stillness that made people uncomfortable. He brought with him a satchel filled with books, scrolls, and strange wooden boards marked with symbols. No one saw him laugh or raise his voice, yet the children took to him instantly. They sat at his feet, listened to his lessons, repeated his words with shining eyes. He didn't just teach letters and numbers. He made the children see patterns in everything, in water, in footsteps, in shadows. He told them that everything speaks, if you know how to listen. The adults weren't so sure. "That one doesn't blink much," said one. "He watches like a hawk," said another. Omer was gone now, passed on peacefully, but those who remembered him recalled the boy he raised in silence. "Could it be?" someone whispered, but no one said it too loudly. No one dared. Then, one sun-hot afternoon, Seon entered the market. His face was lined now, his hair mostly grey, but he still walked like he owned the ground. He barked orders at traders and insulted a poor boy for standing too close. Then, as he picked through a stack of cloth, he looked up and froze. Zui was there, standing quietly near the spice stall, helping a small girl count her mother's coins. Their eyes met. Seon's chest tightened. Something ancient stirred in his spine, like a memory he had tried to strangle long ago. The boy's face meant nothing, yet everything. The calm, the stillness, the way he stared, not afraid, not angry, just knowing. Seon dropped the cloth. He stepped forward, voice low, uncertain. "You, what's your name?" Zui turned slowly, his eyes locked on Seon's. There was no fear, no emotion, just the truth behind the stare. He spoke softly, but each word struck like thunder. Even buried truths grow roots. Then without another word, he turned and walked away, back toward the school where the children waited. Seon stood frozen, the words echoing in his ears, pulsing like blood in his temples. He felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically but something deeper. Something buried long ago was rising. The market watched in silence. No one spoke, no one laughed. A wind blew, lifting the edge of Seon's robe. And for a brief second, he looked smaller, frailer. Something had returned to Kurotu, not just a teacher, not just a boy, but the reckoning, and it had a name. The sun hung low over Kurotu when Zui made the announcement. He had written it in calm script on the school wall. "Tomorrow, a lesson on final numbers. All are welcome." It wasn't loud, wasn't shouted through the market, but it spread. The children carried the message in whispers. The traders passed it on like folded secrets. The elders paused, uncertain, and Seon did not sleep that night. By morning, the entire village had gathered in the clearing near the school. The ground had been swept clean. Stones were placed in a wide circle. In the center stood Zui, wrapped in a robe of deep brown, holding a thin scroll in one hand and a long stick in the other. He didn't shout, he didn't preach, he only spoke. And the people listened, because there was something in his voice that held weight. He spoke of numbers, not the kind used to count coins or grain. No, he spoke of the numbers behind actions, behind time, behind choices. He said some numbers build, others subtract. Some multiply, wounds, pain, power. But some become debts. Debts that no coin can erase. Debts measured not in money, but in breath. He walked among the villagers as he spoke, drawing symbols in the dirt. Equations of days spent in silence, sums of bruises hidden beneath robes, patterns of cruelty passed from father to son. The people watched, eyes wide, lips tight. No one laughed, no one moved. Then he paused. He turned slowly and looked toward the back of the crowd. Children stepped aside. Adults followed their gaze. Seon stood there, arms crossed, but his face pale, sweat glistening at his temple. He didn't speak. Zui gestured. 4 of the village children, the ones who once counted stones and stars with him, walked to Seon and gently took his arms. They did not pull hard. They didn't need to. Seon followed, stiff, like a man walking in a dream. They led him to the center. Zui said nothing at first. Then, slowly, he handed Seon the scroll. Seon's hands shook as he opened it. His eyes scanned the numbers, the symbols, the curved lines and sudden sharp edges. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a threat. It was a single, long, endless equation. His life in digits. Every slap, every kick, every lie, every coin earned through fear, every tear never counted, all of it, balanced, calculated, written in clean black ink. Seon's breath caught, his knees buckled. The crowd gasped as he collapsed, clutching his chest, eyes wide, but no one rushed to help, not even his wife. Behind him, carved into the dirt where he had stood, was a number, the last one. 1. The crowd remained silent, not in fear, not in joy, just silence. Because they understood now, some lessons don't need to be shouted. Some justice doesn't come with swords, it comes in numbers. And Zui had just delivered the final sum. The next morning, the village of Kurotu was quiet. The dust settled softly over Seon's stone house. His body, now lifeless, was carried by a few silent men to the back of his old storehouse, the very spot where Imela had once been buried without a name, without a goodbye. This time there were no secret nights, no hurried hands. It was done in the open, but still, no one cried. No drums were beaten, no prayers were offered, only the sound of dirt falling on wood. Zui was not there. By the time the sun rose fully, he was gone. No one saw him leave. His schoolroom was empty, but clean. On the desk lay a single scroll, tied with a string, and stacks of books neatly arranged. Books filled with numbers, equations, patterns, not just math, but memories, symbols of justice, proof that pain could be measured and answered. The villagers walked through the room quietly, like walking through a sacred place. The chalkboard still held the last line Zui had written before disappearing. Balance must return. One of the elders, who had once turned his head away from Imela's bruises, picked up a stick of chalk. With trembling hands, he wrote above the doorway, Imela's House of Wisdom. The children kept coming. The lessons did not stop. Only now, the numbers meant more. They weren't just for counting fish or trade. They were used to teach fairness, kindness, memory. And when new children asked who was Imela, the elders told them about a woman who had no voice, but gave birth to one. A woman whose silence became a son, and whose pain became a lesson so sharp it could never be forgotten. On the last page of Zui's final book, written in calm handwriting, was a sentence: "Numbers do not lie, and some lives are written in equations of pain, revenge, and truth." That sentence would be taught every year, repeated by every child, etched into the minds of a new generation, so that no one, ever again, would bury the truth.